La Raza Cósmica, the Bronze Race, and the problem of adopting a rhetoric of homogeneity and exceptionalism in Mexico. About 105 years ago in 1913, a day was established to celebrate the so-called union between Spain and the indigenous nations of the Americas. The Spanish politician, once mayor of Madrid, Faustino Rodríguez San Pedro, imposed the establishment of el Día de la Raza, the Day of the Race, or Día de la Hispanidad, Day of Hispanic Descent. He said this day would pay homage to, quote, the intimate existing spirituality between the discovering and civilizing nation and those which were formed in American soil, end quote. But after 300 years of the Spanish Empire's power over the Indies of America, what we really did have as a result of this spirituality was a very marked and obsessive division of social classes as defined by degrees of racial difference to whiteness. This division was clearly defined by the castas, a caste system that reigned over the territories stolen from the many different indigenous nations that lived and thrived in the American continents. When they came here, the Spanish conquistadores did not come to work. They came here to put indigenous as well as African people to work for them. During this moment in history, 1500s onward, three major racial basic groups marked social relations. 1. Cristianos, Christians, which refer to whites, peninsular Spaniards and criollos, the sons and daughters born to them in America. 2. Indios, Indians, misnomer for indigenous Americans and their children. 3. Moros, or black, people with black skin from Africa brought as slaves and their free descendants. The mixtures between these hierarchically classified races were the basis of the caste system, a classification which would dictate the place people would occupy in society. Casta is not a word that was invented due to the differences that suddenly came about from this supposed first ever seen mixing of cultures. This word is Iberian in origin, and it existed in Spanish, Portuguese, and Iberian languages since the Middle Ages. It means lineage, breed, or race. It is derived from an old Latin word castes, which means chaste, implying that lineage is something to be kept pure, or that could somehow become infected, impure. This gave rise to the word in English caste during the early modern period. This initially solely race-based hierarchical system was an early version of the later differentiation of class as designated by the metonym gente de razón, or people who are capable of reasoning, those belonging, of course, to the higher castes, and the gente que no, or those who were incapable of reason due to being assumed inferior, the non-acculturated and non-assimilated indigenous peoples and African peoples. The system of castas was inspired by the assumption that the character and quality of people varied according to their birth, color, race, and origin of ethnic types. The system of castas was more than social racial classification. It impacted every aspect of life, including economics, taxation, who you could marry, and what you could aspire to become in life. Both the Spanish colonial state and the church expected more tax and tribute payments from those of lower social racial categories. Baptismal records included caste designations. This caste system was used for social control and also determined the person's importance in society. In its format and assumptions, this concept is mainly problematic because it presumes racial purity of the three major basic groups, especially the Christian, a euphemism for white Iberian Spanish. It began with 16 basic combinations. A child born in Mexico but with both Spanish parents was called a criollo. The mix of white and indigenous was mestizo. White and black was mulatto, meaning little mule, the white race being seen as a horse and the black race as a donkey. Mulatto and white gave you morisco, meaning only a little bit black, referring to what was considered a taint of black blood in the white blood. Morisco in Spanish, chino. Chino and indigenous, salta pa atrás, meaning a jump backwards because the Morisco had already bettered their caste by being part white, but if they decided to have children with someone indigenous, then their children would be considered a literal jump backwards. Salta pa atrás and mulatto, lobo, meaning wolf. Lower castes acquired the names of animals. Lobo and chino, jíbaro, meaning yokel. Jíbaro and mulata, albarazado, meaning paling or becoming pale. Albarazado and black, cambujo, a word meaning dark or black, usually referring to the color of an animal. Cambujo in indigenous, sambaigo or cuarterón, meaning that walks with legs twisted inward, knock-kneed, or a quarter black. Sambaigo en lobo, calpamulato, meaning container of mulatto. So like saying a mulatto is in there somewhere, referring to the black blood. Calpamulato en sambaigo, tente en el aire, meaning up in the air, referring to a lack of identity. Tente en el aire en mulata, no te entiendo, meaning I do not understand you. Basically, why do you even exist? No te entiendo and indigenous, torna atrás, meaning twisting backwards. There were no limits to the mixes. The borders between one classification and the next were blurry. Even though it tried to be as formal as possible, it was not a very systematic classification system. It could not be very rigid due to lack of access to DNA testing. It was really just about what you looked like or could pass as. It could be hacked and manipulated. It was common that a child would be registered as white so that they may have a higher status. For this, many times, priests were bribed or a Spanish padrino, godfather, was sought out. This is reminiscent of people of color who embrace white supremacy and push forth supremacy. This enactment of performance of whiteness or assimilation allows them to believe they are more likely to rise in the current US cultural and racial caste systems. By the end of the colonial period in 1821, there were more than 100 classifications of racial variations. About 100 years after the end of the colonial period in 1925, José Vasconcelos writes The Cosmic Race, La Raza Cósmica. José Vasconcelos was born in Oaxaca, Mexico in 1882 to parents of European ancestry. Active in Mexican politics, he was exiled during the eras of dictator Porfirio Díaz and Carranza. After the Mexican Revolution and Carranza's presidency ended, eventually in 1920, under the presidency of General Álvaro Obregón, the nation was now prepared to begin a material, ideological, and cultural reconstruction. Vasconcelos returned to Mexico to serve as university president of the National University and as Minister of Public Education from 1921 to 1924. He gathered artists and intellectuals to contribute to the emerging revolutionary culture, a progressive agenda aimed to provide social welfare, widespread literacy, and art for the people. Vasconcelos supported the muralist movement in Mexican art, commissioning painters like Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo's husband, to cover walls of public buildings with nationalist content. It was an attempt to reverse the aesthetic of eurocentric and intellectual dependency on foreign models by firmly grounding art and culture in native tradition, albeit a very mythological version of it. This came to be known as indigenismo, a renewed attention to Mexico's ancient civilizations and indigenous culture, linking art to the nation-building project. Yet, we must also take notice that indigenous culture is only appropriated, for indigenous subjects themselves are missing from active historical participation, art, and meaning-making, while their culture, colors, symbols, and mythologies are being used. With La Raza Cósmica, Vasconcelos attempts to respond to European exceptionalism as founded in modernity. Let's break this down. What is modernity? In this case, we are referring to the term when it was first used at the end of the 15th century in Europe to distinguish the present time as very much Christian from the pagan Roman past. It was supposed to refer to a clear departure from classical antiquity, so links to the Greek and Romans. During the Renaissance up to about 1700, there was this idea that Europe needed to return to the classics as a way to validate their culture, epistemology, and aesthetics. Then at this point, a new period developed, the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which challenged systematically this Renaissance idea of returning to the classics. Instead, it compromised with the idea of the infinite progress of knowledge and the rational advance of moral and social orders. This would finally cement the definition of Europeans versus antiquity. Europeans as a people leading the way toward the future, toward modernity. Modernity brought with it a modernist aesthetic, which was most clearly presented and expressed by Voltaire, who helps produce further the idea of a new modern way of understanding time, subjectivity, and experience. This new perception of time was originally expressed in the form of a rebellion standing against the normative weight of tradition with a projection towards the future. Modernity started as an incomplete project. Why? Because it opened a future beyond the dictates of tradition, but lacked an understanding of the historical rational project topic that would find expression in the work of Enlightenment philosophers. This did not happen until philosopher-sociologist Max Weber from the Frankfurt School made a clear connection between Enlightenment philosophies and modernity in the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. This brings us back to the time of Vasconcelos. Weber explained and pushed forward the myth of the European miracle, the exceptional character of Europe versus the rest of the world. Under the Weberian concept of modernity, legitimacy was achieved through the adoption or assimilation of formats used to validate cultural spheres. These formats of rationalization were strictly European and distinguished by the division of claims and arguments about the world into questions of knowledge, taste, and justice. These claims were further developed, articulated within cultural spheres of science, aesthetics, and morality with their own eurocentric cannibalistic criteria for judging truth, beauty, and moral character. These are the European criteria for legitimacy, for value. They work under the assumption that all humans function under a telos, or a single purposiveness of the human species. Cultural variations are perceived and understood as stages in a unilinear development toward a single telos. This is the myth of modernity, which stands on the hierarchization of difference and the supposed golden child of culture that will eventually be universally achieved by using these Eurocentric formats to legitimize all human culture. As a modern subject, Vasconcelos is left with two options. One, reject modernity and the reification of the criteria, or the fallacy of turning the abstract myth into concrete reality. And two, attempt to provide a new basis for the continuation of such a project. Even though Vasconcelos writes with an argument against Anglo-European and US-American exceptionalism by expressing that the exceptionality lies in the mixed peoples of the Americas, he also makes special claims of his own under this same criteria/format of legitimization, which was also the basis for the logic behind the justification of colonialism and its permanence in coloniality. Vasconcelos in content rejects modernity and its mythology of the European as supreme, but in format he provides a continuation of the project of supremacy and hierarchical thinking by replacing white with the bronze of brown race as supreme. Let's give Vasconcelos a break though. He was seeking to refute the attitudes that considered Spanish colonized Americas as a lesser New World than the Anglo colonized counterparts in the United States. He went to acquire information of the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Andes to attempt a Latino renaissance. He also made great use of mestizaje, or the mixture of bloods, as the most legitimizing identity when the mixture was seen as something negative, as we can see from the no te entiendo and the tente en el aire castes. This mixed identity was drenched in pain, anger, and shame, for it initiated with the conquest and the foundational violence on our indigenous mothers. Vasconcelos assumes that there was in fact an integration of cultures between the indigenous and the European. He attempts to legitimize our existence under the premise of the logic of European modernity, its format which made claims to exceptionality in the "look at us, we can also be exceptional like you, but not really like you. We're actually better than you. We are the future of the human race." Vasconcelos says mestizaje is the moral and material basis for the union of all men into a fifth universal race, the fruit of all the previous ones, and amelioration of everything past. With this fifth race, Vasconcelos not only attempts to give us a shot at the modern concept of the infinite future, but he's also attempting to appease the traumas of the past. Traumas cannot be shoved under the rug, and much less with the same devices that were once used to justify the dehumanization of our ancestors and our current indigenous and black siblings. Mexico was going through a new state transformation, and the nation wanted to unify under nationalist goals. His audience, though, is essentially the cultural elite of the Americas, not the indigenous, not the descendants of the races of lower castes, but the new race of Mexican intellectuals educated in the European logic and format. It was and still continues to be a very influential essay where Vasconcelos predicted the coming of a new age, the aesthetic era in which joy, love, fantasy, and creativity would prevail over the rationalism he saw as dominating the present age. In this new age, marriages would no longer be dictated by necessity or convenience, but by love and beauty. Ethnic obstacles already in the process of being broken down, especially in Latin America, would disappear altogether, giving birth to a fully mixed race, a cosmic race in which all the better qualities of each race would persist by the natural selection of love. In a nutshell, Vasconcelos attempts to say that a better race would come from all the mixed mixing. He presented the brown race as better and superior because it has all the elements of the other races and understands all the differences. Usually, critics of Vasconcelos claim that the problem with La Raza Cósmica is that he seems to be anti-foreigner, or as a racial patriot overzealous for the interests of Mexico and Spanish America. He was not objecting to the United States. He was only opposing to its political influence in Mexico because it was always for the benefit of big business interests and for a few Mexican traders whose conduct is that of despots and military dictators. In what ways does the cosmic race repeat the myth of modernity? What are some possible effects? The cosmic race follows the logic of coloniality in the way that it looks for a winner, for a hierarchy where white is simply replaced with brown. Brown becomes that representation of what is best, what is most powerful, most desirable. The cosmic race is utterly racialist. It was part of the unifying nationalist goals of Mexico's new state formation and its longing to be considered a modern nation state in its own right during the 1920s. It is playing with the ideals of the myth of mestizaje, a syncretism of cultures and races that supposedly unites to create a new homogenous brown. It is a dense piece of rhetoric of modernity filled with contradictions and ambivalence. It is written for the elite about the pride for elements of the marginalized without the input from the marginalized subjects. This further relegated the indigenous and black mestizos while it left out the Asians. Vasconcelos looks for validation from the white Anglo and European nation states, speaking to their perverse logic of coloniality, now through the myth of modernity as a one-size-fits-all universal conceptualization of the world and life in general. And this becomes parallel to a new bronze cosmic race to rule over all other races. Vasconcelos completely ignores the murder, bloodshed, and destructive consequences of colonialism on the so-called black, red, yellow, and brown races. He claims that Europe's expansionist project serves as a bridge uniting the four racial trunks: the black, the Indian, the Mongol, and the white. He calls mestizos the fifth universal race because without the concept of race, you would have no identity, as the perverse logic tells us so. He makes a differentiation between Anglo colonists and Spanish colonists through misogynistic perspectives by saying that the Spanish were the lesser of the two evils because they mixed, while forgetting to mention, though, it was through rape and violence, as opposed to the Anglos, who were worse because they would rather kill the indigenous people. While focusing on the indigenous ancestry, Vasconcelos leaves out our Asian and African roots in Latin America. He forms a supposed Latin American identity on the basis of Spanish and English as the most influential and strongest Europeans, who are also the most different from each other. He keeps referring back to Anglo power as he lived in the border and went to school in the US. From his observations, which we can assume are drenched with the cultural validations of a eurocentric perspective, he claimed that the Anglos continued to conquer us. In his highly colonized perspective, he does understand that the present state of civilization still imposes patriotism on us as a necessity for the defense of material and moral interests, but it is indispensable for this patriotism to seek vast and transcendental aims. Then he claims that this was cut short by the 1810 Mexican War of Independence and says it is necessary to bring it all back to the flow of its universal historical destiny, modernity. So the questions are, how does Vasconcelos' biological model of utopian advancement account for other races? What about the place of women, or that of people with non-heterosexualities? How does the myth of modernity and universality increase marginalization and ensure hierarchical societies? Vasconcelos says that no race returns, that they state their mission, accomplish it, and pass away. How does this statement use a perverse logic of coloniality to justify the events and consequences of colonization in the Americas? Here's some hints. Myth of progress. And what's the price of this evolution? 3. Would you say Vasconcelos calls for universality or pluriversality? Why? What would be the difference? Can we imagine such a thing as pluriversality?